Okay, let's start. First of all, let me say that I'm so glad to welcome Jeromin Zettelmeyer here at Science Europe. Jeromin, actually, I think is the quintessential Science Europe guest speaker. He has very strong academic background, but even more important, what he has is a very wide policy experience, really a transatlantic one. Jeromin and I met many years ago. We both had heirs, he still has some, so he's better, at the IMF, which he joined out of school, just finished his PhD at MIT. He stayed at the IMF for quite some time. And then he moved to the EBRD as Director of Research and Deputy Chief Economist. Then he decided to move to Germany, where he was the Director General for Economic Policy at the German Ministry for Economic Affairs. Then he moved back to DC at the Peterson Institute. It is probably the leading international economics think tank, where he was a senior fellow. Then he moved back to the IMF with a very senior position as Deputy Director of Strategic and Policy Review Department. It is the department in charge of making sure that IMF program follows rules almost all the times, and I would not ask you about Greece or Ukraine. Then he moved out of the IMF and he joined the Bruegel think tank in Brussels, where he has been director since 2022. He's a research fellow at the CPR, and he has a lot of publications, including topics like financial crisis, economic growth, European monetary case factor, sovereign debt, and many other things. Today's talk is very crucial for our thinking here at SAIS, is on European economic security in an interdependent world. Jeremy, for yours.
Thank you so much, Tito, for the very kind introduction. I'm really, really happy to be here and honored that you came to listen. So, as you might have inferred from Tito's introduction, this is not going to be a proper academic presentation. I don't know if that's good or bad. So what I'm going to do is I will give you my or our policy takeaways. So this our refers to my two co-authors on this slide, Jean Pisani-Ferry and Beatrice Vega Di Mauro, of a report, sort of a multi-chapter compilation that we edited, that was published in May of this year, about European economic security, and the report is written mostly by academics. So the authors are all on this slide. There's a chapter on industrial policy by Morgan Kelly and Kevin O'Rourke. There's a chapter on sort of very disaggregated trade issues written by Isabelle Méjean and Pierre Rousseau. Then there's this very long group of authors, starting with David Bakai and ending with Shiwan Yang Li, who have a model-based simulation of a scenario in which the G7 plus Europe, the EU plus allies stop trading completely with China. So it's a decoupling from China, hard decoupling from China scenario, and then they see sort of what happens to all countries involved. There's a nice chapter on trade policy by Chet Bowen, who used to be at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and is now the chief economist of the State Department. I had dinner with him last night, and we sort of discussed some of the issues that are behind this report. And then we have two Bruegel authors, Conor McCaffrey and Nicolas Poitier, with a chapter on European economic security instruments, basically what has been done at the EU level to improve economic security over the last 2 years also. So what I'm going to give you is sort of a rather personal view of the most important lessons to draw from this work, and it's really focused on two chapters, namely the chapter by Isabelle Méjean and Pierre Rousseau, and the chapter by David Bakai et al. Doesn't mean that the other chapters are not important, but for the purpose of the summary, that's what I'm going to draw on. And it doesn't go through these chapters in detail. It just gives you sort of the main takeaway from each, and then on that basis, I'm going to draw some sort of policy lessons. Okay, the first is I just want to clarify my terms. So there is a huge muddle since, I would say, since the Trump presidency. I'm worried that we might soon have to refer to it as the first Trump presidency. There's a big muddle between a number of related terms. So in Europe, we have used the word strategic autonomy a lot. The French introduced that, Macron introduced that. There's now this pervasive term economic security, which we really didn't use only 2 years ago. It's pretty new. Everyone talks about competitiveness. When Macron gives speeches, he tends to conflate economic security and competitiveness, which I don't think is necessarily a good idea. And then, of course, we have this notion that in the national security area, Europe should be more independent, do more for itself. So I think it's best to keep sort of three concepts apart, which all sort of feed, if you like, into a European sovereignty or security agenda. One is a national security proper. So this has to do with the capacity of the EU to defend itself against foreign threats. And here, you know, the defining characteristic is that the nature of these threats is either military or, you know, refers to cyber attacks or infrastructure, but it's not about, you know, squeezing a rival or getting squeezed by a rival economically, right? That's, for me, that's national security. It could be, though, that in order to defend yourself against these hard threats, you need to interfere with trade, payments, or foreign direct investment. So this issue that, you know, we should not export military technologies to our rivals would fall under this category. The issue that we should not allow foreign direct investment into critical infrastructure that they can then be disabled by a potential rival also would be national security for me. But the instruments that you need to control this could be economic policy instruments like restrictions to trade, restrictions to FDI. For this reason, there are some people, and that includes actually the European Commission, that sort of lump this in with economic security, right? But the objective is not economic security, it's not economic, it's national security. Okay, then we have economic security proper, sort of in the narrow sense, and that we define as the capacity to withstand trade or supply chain disruptions, regardless of whether they are accidental or whether they are on purpose, economic coercion, which is on purpose. So usually this is sort of basically low-level economic pain, mostly for political purposes. So China has done this about 24 times, you know, against Lithuania, against Australia, against the EU, against Japan, and it's sort of triggered by essentially a desire to send a political message and to influence public opinion or put the political class under pressure. And typically this takes the form of restrictions to exports from the Chinese perspective. So for example, rare earths exports to Japan were stopped for a while, or maybe import boycotts. So they boycotted Australian wine. This was because, you know, Australia had made some remarks essentially blaming, which were interpreted as being the Chinese for COVID. And so it's sort of a form of protest, but it can be quite unpleasant. And then, of course, there's sort of the maximal version of that, where you are really, really trying to hurt an adversary through economic means, and that is sanctions. So this is what we have been doing with Russia, and, you know, conceivably there could be a sanction scenario there involving China as well. Okay, and then we have the third set of issues, which is competitiveness. And, you know, for me, that's something, for me, that's something completely different. So, like most economists, I don't like the word competitiveness because it's a sort of something that you can apply to firms, but it's sort of hard to apply to countries. Countries are not like firms. But economists have sort of come to terms with the term and essentially identified with productivity growth. If you identify competitiveness with productivity growth, then this is, of course, a huge thing, and it's a very traditional thing. You know, economics is about increasing productivity growth. 80% of economics is about that. And so it's not really about security. Security is something that has to do with second moments, with risks. Competitiveness has something to do with first moments, with just, you know, in expectation you want to grow faster. Now, having said that, it may feed into both national and economic security, because if you grow faster, you can also defend yourself better and be more independent and so forth. On the other hand, there could be trade-offs between competitiveness and economic security. And one particular trade-off, of course, is that if you're really worried mostly about external economic security, the best thing you can do is to shut yourself off completely against trade, and that would be a disaster for growth. So this is why it's quite useful to keep these things apart. Okay, so this is a little chart is mainly for the economists. So, people like Tito and myself, when this whole talk about economic security started, we were like, what the hell is going on? We, particularly at international organizations like the IMF, we've been thinking about crisis prevention forever. So this seems to be just another word for crisis prevention. And so to some extent that's true, but it goes a bit beyond that. So what you see on this matrix is in the columns, the origins of bad things happening. So this can be a domestic shock, can be an external shock, like the trade disruption or COVID or something like that. Or it could be a deliberate action by a government. Economists typically don't think about deliberate actions so much. We mainly think about these shocks, but this is sort of the security dimension of it. If you look at the rows of the matrix, these are the propagation channels for the bad things. So in the first two rows, you have the traditional economic channels, trade investment, payments, financial, profit repatriation, that sort of thing. And then we have sort of non-economic channels, disease, military, cyber attacks, other things. And so you can sort of essentially map various types of bad things or risks using a combination of columns and rows. And so, typical economic crisis would be worrying about domestic and external shocks with respect to trade, investment, and financial channels. The national security people, they worry about deliberate actions from other governments, and they're really focused on the whole gamut of what through which others can get to you as a country. And the economic security risks, as we define it, cut across these two categories. They focus on economic channels, but they include deliberate action as a source of bad stuff. Okay, this slide is mostly for the economists, who, we are, as economists, we are, so the others can interrupt, or think about something else. As economists, we are always compelled to justify policy intervention, right? Because maybe markets take care of themselves, take care of everything. And, there's a reasonable case that if you have something like the COVID port closures, and if you have, saber rattling by China and the Straits of Taiwan, and if you have a, increased sense of geopolitical risk, maybe firms will do the necessary thing to protect themselves if they're involved in international trade, and hence they will also protect their suppliers, their employees, and their customers. And so why does the state need to intervene at all? So basically there are, because I'm going to go and argue that there are some forms of state intervention that we should be thinking of. And so there are basically three stories. The first is just an information story. They may not have full information of how at risk they are. Now, here, of course, there's a question of whether the state necessarily has better information. It may not. Then there's a thing called network externalities. So, usually if you have economic relationships, you're sitting in a supply chain. You'll have an upstream firm and a downstream firm, someone who sells you stuff, someone you sell stuff to. Then presumably the risk of a trade disruption is going to be priced into the terms of exchange between your upstream and downstream firms. So if you don't take measures, if you have, for example, a supply structure that is very concentrated, then presumably firms are not going to want to buy your stuff unless you give them a low price, right? So maybe the market mechanism takes care of this. It produces an incentive to reduce risk. But then what is probably not priced is your role as a firm for the entire supply chain. So it's not just the next firm, downstream firm, that's really going to suffer. if you don't do things properly, it's also going to be the one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that. And so there's a sense that the risk that you're imposing for the entire network is not priced properly, and therefore you don't take enough caution. And then the third is a very classic story. The economists love that. They call that moral hazard. So maybe firms, I mean, think of the German exporter or a large German firm that sells to China or is in China. And, you know, the CEO is on the plane that brings Chancellor Scholz to his latest meetings with Xi Jinping. So, you know, if you're on the plane with the Chancellor, you might think, and the Chancellor is sort of encouraging, you know, German investment Chancellor, you might be forgiven for thinking that, you know, if you stay put in China, if things really go bad, maybe the government's going to bail you out. Because after all, you were on the plane with Scholz and he sort of gave you the signals that would be a good thing to actually, it would be okay to continue in China. Okay, so for all these three reasons, there might be sort of this generic case for policies focused on de-risking. Now, the problem is, what does it exactly mean? So what should be the aims of the government when it seeks to de-risk trade relationships? And the reason why this question matters a lot is because of course, you know, as always in life, it's full of trade-offs. You know, de-risking may be costly. And so here we have written down sort of the top 4 reasons from an EU perspective. And by the way, the first 3 reasons apply to any country, not just to EU countries, of why de-risking may be costly. And by far, the most important one is the first. So the idea here is that you may be too trade dependent on a rival that may want to exploit this dependency. And the reason why you're dependent is because you purchase, you know, your imports and your exports are quite concentrated in that particular rival. Now, the important thing to realize is that economics, basic economics tells you that specialization in international trade is a source of efficiency, right? So we can collectively achieve a higher living standard if every country produces what is in its comparative advantage, what it does relatively best to others. Now, if you do that, you're automatically in an extreme sort of Ricardian trade model, every country is just going to produce one thing. So everyone will be super dependent on everyone else. And that's optimal from an efficiency point of view. Now, real life is not like that. The Ricardian trade model is not exactly correct, but still, the flavor of international trade is that you are dependent on countries that are able to sell stuff more cheaply than others. And so if you try to reduce those dependencies, you're also reducing the benefits of international trade. The second point is important because these days, you know, this economic security concept is identified completely with external threats or risks, but in fact, you know, domestic risks also count. And of course, if you're internationally integrated, you can better diversify those risks. So think about COVID. Now, COVID was sort of an international shock, but you know, I don't think you could really seriously have protected yourself from COVID by going into autarky. You know, viruses transmit very easily. Now, conditional on having a COVID problem, of course, you were much better off being able to trade than not being able to trade, because you may not have had the equipment. For example, you may not have had the vaccines. In fact, for the vaccine production, trade was absolutely essential. So there's this famous anecdote where the EU wanted to get tough on the UK, the vaccine-related issue, until it realized that the EU vaccines that it was contemplating not sending to the UK required an input from the UK. And then that was the end of that story. So trade was really essential in reducing sometimes of risks. The third is a really important point, particularly here, since you're supposed to worry not just about economics, but also about the politics of international relations. An aggressive reduction in integration can damage international cooperation. So this is a non-economic cost of de-risking. And so the way I think of it is through 2 channels. First, it's a signal. So if we were to go and say to China, look, we're really done with you guys. We're going to reduce our trade by half because we really don't trust you. that might have very serious spillovers on our ability to cooperate with China in areas that are very important, like climate change, for example. They're just going to be upset. They're going to think, oh, okay, no trust. It would affect other parts of the relationship that have nothing to do with trade per se. And then there's a very old argument, which I'm told is very well studied in international relations, and apparently international relations people, I don't know if there are any here, call this the security dilemma. And so this is the idea that if you try to protect yourself from foreign threats, you make it actually more likely that those threats are going to come true, because the costs of aggressive behavior are going to be high. Did I say this right? The cost of aggressive behavior are going to be lower. So basically, this is the flip side of this idea that trade relations make you safer, which is an idea that got discredited because the Germans took it too far with Putin. You know, they thought, you know, if we are highly integrated with the Russians, it would not be in their interest to attack us or our allies, and so we don't need to worry, and we can continue and being dependent. So it doesn't always work if you have sort of a notorious, misguided, irrational dictator. This doesn't work, but the idea is still powerful and empirically broadly true, I understand. And of course, this is the very idea that underlies the European Union. This is the Schuman Declaration, right? The idea that trade integration would be critical to preventing a future war between France and Germany. And so if we reduce trade integration, the opposite might happen. That war might become more likely. Okay, so the question then is, how can you increase economic security while taking into account all these constraints and trade-offs? And so there is a kind of consensus answer to this question, which has sort of been building up over the last 2 or 3 years. And the conventional prescription is that you should be very selective in your reduction in dependency, so you don't hurt trade too much. And you should do it mostly through diversifying trade. So don't, you know, reduce trade across the board because you still want to have the benefits of trade. Just focus on those products where you're highly dependent, meaning that your import structure is very concentrated, right? You're very dependent on just one supplier, China, for example, and then focus on that and reduce that. Okay, and so the punchline of my talk is that this answer, even though it sounds incredibly appealing, is probably wrong, or at least it's extremely incomplete. Okay, and so the rest of the talk is I'm going to show you why. Okay, so the answer is basically comes in 2 parts, and each of these parts corresponds to one takeaway from the report, and each of the takeaways corresponds to either chapter 3 or chapter 4 of the report. And so the first takeaway, which is, you know, a rather trivial point. I mean, if you want to sort of selectively de-risk by zoning in on the products where there's a real risk that dependency might get abused, and then the economic costs of that are very big, right? That's the underlying idea. You have to be able to identify those products. It turns out that even with, you know, all the academic prowess that these 2 authors, Isabelle and Pierre, and Isabelle is sort of the top trade economist in this field. She teaches in Paris. With all this prowess, it turns out this is almost impossible to do. And the reason is that you are going to have lots of type 1 errors and lots of type 2 errors, meaning you're going to have many reasons to miss or underestimate dependencies. The main one being that you may underestimate it because you only, for the most part, know your direct supplier, but not the supplier of the supplier. So in particular, dependence on a country like China might be underestimated because it works through several intermediaries and you don't really know all these channels. But then the other point, the second line is as important or more important. There are also reasons why you may exaggerate these dependencies, and that is because dependencies are conventionally identified by taking a snapshot of trade as it currently exists. It's a purely descriptive exercise. So they look at, I will show you this in the next slide, they look at the supplier structure at the product level of stuff that is imported to the EU. They compare it to how much we produce. If there's a high import content, and if the suppliers are very concentrated, they call that a dependency. So there are many things there that really matter, which are really hard to get at. So the first is, it's a snapshot. But what we're really interested in is not so much a snapshot, but we're interested in a stress test or an elasticity, if you like, right? So what you want to know is what would happen if you lose that supplier? So one thing you might do is you could switch to another supplier. So the ease of doing that is normally not captured in these studies. The other thing you might do is, if you cannot find another supplier, is you might be able to switch to another good that serves a broadly similar function. So one example, I'll show you down here. So this is sort of the list. You probably cannot see it very well, but this is the list of the top 30 or so trade dependencies of the European Union. And our top 6, the top 6 dependencies, I can zoom in. Oops, okay, this is wrong. Oh, I missed it. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Wonderful. Yeah.
Okay, but I have to stay close to the microphone. Okay, so you see the 6 or so is artificial flowers. So 95% of the artificial flowers imported into the EU come from China. Now, we might be able to find another supplier of artificial flowers, but even if that's not true, we might be able to substitute artificial flowers by natural flowers. Okay? So maybe it's not such a big deal to be dependent on China for artificial flowers. Another thing which we might do is substitute intertemporally. So you see the next dependency from China is electrothermic appliances, which is basically electric blankets. Or you could have things like, electric blankets are their own line below, or you could have vacuum flasks, camping goods. So intertemporal substitution means you don't buy this stuff for a while. Yeah, you wait. You use your current camping equipment a bit longer. And it's not a welfare disaster to not be able to purchase new camping equipment from China. Now, I shouldn't make fun of this only. I mean, it's pretty clear that the people who are worried about dependency, normally they don't mean consumer goods. So maybe one should have just eliminated all these consumer goods from this slide, in which case you would be left with, for the most part, as far as China is concerned, a coterie of mysterious sounding chemicals, at least to an economist, very mysterious sounding chemicals. Phosphorus pentoxide, which is our top dependency from China, or magnesium. Now, magnesium rings the bell. Okay, that's like a critical raw material, which you need that for batteries and all kinds of stuff. But the phosphorus pentoxide doesn't ring a bell. And so the point here is that we may not know, whether we could substitute the supplier. We don't know whether we can substitute the good. Maybe there's another chemical that does something similar. And we don't know if we cannot do any of these, how much it actually hurts. What is the economic cost associated with a, say, 2-year disruption where you cannot import this stuff? And it's an exaggeration to say that no one has any idea. But very few people have ideas and they're not published. So the Mejean and can you make it small again? So the Mejean and Rousseau, they do something that they call, first of all, this is their algorithm, how they go through the various goods to decide what's a dependency. And so to identify whether this might have a big cost, it's not on the slide. They have something they call the upstreamness of the product. So what they can say is into how many supply chains the products feeds, but how much of the output shock or welfare shock comes out if there's a disruption, they still cannot say. So this is a problem, and I will tell you in a second how one might get around. Okay, so what are the implications of this first takeaway? So there are basically two. There are two sort of reactions. The first reaction is the one that I got when I first presented this at the European Commission, which to their great credit has been on this topic relatively early, immediately after the COVID disruptions. And they were the original generator of these type of dependency studies. And basically they told me, Jeromin, you're right, this is very difficult, but it just means we have to do more. We have to go deeper in both directions. We have to understand the supply chains better, like who is the producer, the supplier of the supplier of the supplier. And then in the other direction, we have to have more information about the role of specific imports in downstream supply chains. And, you know, it's really, as an economist, you would think, oh, maybe what one needs for that is a really, really granular input-output analysis. But the point is that even the input-output analysis is only going to be a snapshot, because it's not true that the Leontief coefficients are all, you know, Leontief meaning, I mean, there is still something going to be substitutability. So if really, I think the only thing that works is to talk to people. That's what, you know, the Americans are doing, and maybe to some extent the Europeans are doing, right? So you have essentially in the security apparatus of the US government, you have people that start with the lists and they go around and they ask people in the industry, what does this mysterious substance actually do, right? And so little by little, you can get something out of it. Okay, but the main lesson for us economists is, look, even if you do all these things, you're not going to be completely safe, right? So it would be nice to look for another way of protecting yourself that doesn't rely on identifying product-specific dependencies correctly. And what you really want is something that's less information sensitive, where you don't, it's not a disaster if you're wrong. And so there are two such things. The first thing is, I mean, this is more a slogan. The question is what is behind this, is resilience, okay? Resilience is sort of the catch term for protecting yourself against any shock. So you don't need to know where the threat's going to come from. You're just resilient. Now, what does it mean, resilience in practice? I think in this context, it means that you have very low trade frictions with a whole bunch of countries that you trust. And so, of course, the number one for us in the European Union is the internal market. The single market is the single best economic security policy. And the beautiful thing about the single market is that single market deepening is also good for growth. So there's no trade-off between security growth. But more broadly, it's about reducing trade frictions with more or less trusted partners. And the other thing you can do, obviously, is deterrence. So if you find a way of sort of exploiting mutual dependency, of hitting back, or threatening to hit back, again, you don't need to know where the threat is exactly going to come from, because wherever it happens, you can retaliate in some form. Okay, the second main takeaway, and then I'm done. Okay, this is based on a model. And here, the main, I will show you the model in one slide. The main lesson is the cost of a hard stop to trade with a highly integrated partner, and in the model it is China, is an order of magnitude higher than the cost of a gradual decoupling of trade. And so the intuition here is a gradual decoupling is costly, but basically the costs are the permanent welfare losses of trading with a smaller group of partners, right? After you have subtracted the costs of getting there, of rearranging trading relationships. And it turns out in their model that these are quite low. So let me just show you. So this is the so-called Vakai-Fari model, which is a disaggregated model of international trade, 43 countries, 56 sectors. In their version, they have 3 trading blocks. One they call friends, one they call rivals, and then the rest of the world. The decoupling is a full stop in trade between the friends and rivals, but both friends and rivals continue trading with the rest of the world. That's and each other, right? So that's very important. So it's not that the world completely fragments into 3 blocks. Now, the focus of this paper is Germany, but this is because they wanted to sell it mostly to a German audience. They have results for all papers, all countries. And so the headline numbers is that if from one day to another, so about 12% of German exports go to China also. If this stops from one day to another, Germany suffers a severe recession. Now, we could have voted of how big you think that recession is. The maximum they can tease out is 5% of GDP. So the level effect in the first year, the drop of output in the first year of 5% of GDP. So this is a lot like the COVID crisis. It's not worse than COVID, it's about like COVID. if you look at what would happen to China, it's even bigger because China is more export dependent than or trade dependent than Germany, so it would be an 8% shock. And now, if you do it very slowly over time, then basically the costs are those that correspond to the permanent welfare cost of trading with a smaller group, namely only with the friends and the third countries, and the costs are much lower, 1.25% of gross national income. For the other countries, the long-run effects are smaller. For the US, it's a much bigger economy, and it's currently also more closed, so it's about 0.4, 0.5% of GDP, the long-term cost for the US, and for the other EU countries, it's somewhere between there and Germany. And so what this analysis does is it answers the following question. So when Tito and I were still in Washington, the Russians invaded Ukraine, and then there was sort of the sense that we are going to go back to the Cold War, and this might include China. And the question then was, is this going to be a disaster or not? And, my first reaction was, when I joined the IMF in 1990, we were practically, or 92, I think, we were practically, or maybe 94, I don't know, a long time ago. We were practically still in the Cold War, but it only just ended. And yet, there was huge post-war growth, prosperity, and the multilateral system was working just fine. It just happened to work on a portion of the world, not on the entire world, right? The Soviet Union was outside in some other communist countries. So what's the big deal about returning to this sort of divided world? We can still do multilateralism, we can still do trade in the free world. Okay, so if you think like that, the main objection you get is, Jeromin, you're forgetting that the Soviet Union was an economic dwarf, but China is an economic giant. So there's no way back. It's impossible. This paper basically says, actually, if the way back is gradual, there is a way back. And the reason is that even though the world would lose, we would lose quite a bit in not being able to trade China, there's enough heterogeneity, right? There's enough sources of comparative advantage in the rest of the world, such that if we can continue trading among ourselves and we can continue with the global south, most of the gains of trade still go through, even without China. So the important thing is, the difficult thing would be to extricate ourselves, but once we have extricated ourselves, the long-term welfare losses are not that big. Okay, so what are the implications of this analysis? Well, the first is a reminder that, this obsession with import dependence, which is everywhere, is not maybe the main thing. Export dependence also matters, so the big economic losses come through both sides in this scenario analysis. And then the second and main point is that because the impact cost of a decoupling is an order of magnitude of perhaps 5 times higher than the cost of a slow decoupling, this may justify an across-the-board preemptive reduction in trade integration with a potentially hostile partner. So it's basically like an insurance premium, right? So if you think there will be a Taiwan incident in the next 3 years with probability 0.5 or 0.8, and you think that if we go then into full-blown sanction scenarios on both sides, there's going to be a COVID-type shock, then you would be well advised to start reducing your trade exposure now. It's that type of argument. And the big difference to the conventional prescription is that you would do that for all product lines. You would not be in the business of identifying, the magnesiums, the phosphates, the whatever, but it's about extricating yourself across the board. So it leads you to a very different policy conclusion than the approach that is currently contemplated. Before you get the wrong ideas, I'm not advocating this, okay? I'll tell you what I advocate. So this is the summary of the policy implications, and then I have one more slide on what the US has been doing, then I'm done. So for me, what I take away from this is, by all means, do import level product specific de-risking on products where you really know that the cost of interruption are going to be very large. And you do know a few of those, right? So there's the chips, there's the natural gas, there's critical medical supplies. Solar panels do not count here. If the Chinese stop us sending solar panels, what happens is that the increase in energy supply is going to be slower. Doesn't mean that energy supply stops. It's completely different from gas, right? We should be all importing Chinese solar panels as long as they send them to us at very low prices. We don't have a serious industry. It's a good idea to do this. The green transition needs them. Okay, but for the other stuff, by all means, we should de-risk for those product lines where we really think we're dependent and an interruption would really hurt. Then the second is this point about looking for information insensitive ways to reduce risk, raising resilience and strengthening deterrence. Third lesson is to worry about export dependency and also financial dependency. We haven't talked about it all, rather than just import dependency. And then there's this enticing idea out there from the Bakay et al. Paper that we may want to consider a gradual reduction in overall integration with China. But if we do that, you should consider two things, and those lead me to, in the end, not advocate this path. One is that this reduction of integration may be happening endogenously already and possibly will overshoot. So over the last 12 months or so, German exports to China have slowed sharply, and FDI into China has showed sharply. So this is maybe one of these things where the market's already delivered this. And finally, as I said at the beginning, if we do this very deliberately and aggressively, it will have unintended consequences that are outside their model, namely the damage to international cooperation. Final slide. So if these are the main sort of policy implications, it's worth comparing it to what the EU has actually done over the last 2 years or so. So they have focused almost exclusively on this import de-risking. So in that sense, they've done okay, particularly on critical raw materials and chips. Maybe the means are not always the right means, but they have certainly pushed, I think, the right product lines. Less convincingly, they have also tried to promote clean tech as an economic security instrument. Well, I don't think this is a valid argument. I think that's a competitiveness issue, not an economic security issue. The main fault is that the policy instruments are quite weak, right? So it's mostly like procurement tools, regulatory tools. I'm not sure how far you can get with this, but this reflects just the problem of the fact that the EU doesn't have money at the EU level. Okay, then what they have not emphasized very much is to raise resilience via the deeper single market. So it's now become en vogue through the letter report and through Draghi, but the original response was not about that. One point where the EU has done very well is on deterrence. And you know who we have to thank for that? Trump. So after Trump, basically the French, among others, got really nervous and the strategic autonomy debate really got going. And so the French pushed something which the others didn't like very much initially, but now we are happy that we have it, which is something called the anti-coercion instrument, which is basically a legal instrument that allows the EU, following a certain process, to retaliate, essentially using any means against the companies of a country that's being nasty. So you have to go through steps. It's a well-structured process. The Commission needs to propose. They need to check some criteria, and the NP Council has to agree with qualified majority. But once you are there, you can basically prohibit a company from a country that's being nasty to you to sell in the EU, for example. You can do anything. Of course, it would be against WTO rules to do it. But you know, the answer you get then from the EU is, well, this is just supposed to be deterrence. We don't actually want to. Okay, export dependency, financial dependency, these things have been largely ignored. And of course, you know, as an economist, you always suspect that, look, if you have import dependency and export dependency, and they're roughly symmetric, and the only thing that people worry about is import dependency, we sort of smell a rat, right? We smell the rat of the special interests of producers in the EU who would rather get rid of import competition, but they don't want to be interfered with as far as exports are concerned, particularly at a time when competitiveness is an issue. Okay, and the point of reducing integration with China would be comparatively easy to do. It would likely have unintended consequences. The political economy is extremely difficult. And there are probably better options like taking a prudential approach to company or sector exposures, basically telling a German company, okay, be free to do in China what you need to do, but make sure you have a contingency plan, you have enough capital to deal with, for example, a disruption to repatriation profits. And then the final point, you know, you have heard me say the word China about 30 times. You haven't heard me say the word United States 2 times. If Trump gets elected, we may have to say the word United States in this context a whole lot more. Let me stop. Thank you.
Let's open the floor. I'm sure that you have, and also students, you have international relations students, I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Annabelle. I study European public policy here at SAIS. Thank you so much for these insights. I have two questions. One would be if you can tell us a little bit what the general perception of the WTO is in Brussels, because here in our economics classes, we talk a lot about, that since 2017, things have changed and it's not clear if there is even still some leverage for the WTO. And then my other question is more about your job, because you mentioned your discussions with the EU Commission. So I would be interested in what that relationship looks like. Are these expert hearings that you get invited to, or is it meetings that you request? And what is the general interaction between Bruegel and the EU Commission? Thank you.
Let's take another one.
Hi, hold on. Hi, Manuela Moschella, I'm a jacket here and a professor of political science at the University of Bologna. So I'm probably getting into from the political science perspective here. I was intrigued on your talk on several grounds, but thinking about the EU, right? You presented the EU rightly as a bloc. So you're analyzing the dependency of the EU as a bloc, but we know that, of course, the EU is made up of very different states. So I'm wondering if you analyze the different de-risking risks across EU member states, and how do you think these diverging risks across countries affect your overall conclusions? So that what would be one question. The second question I have regards one of your conclusions, because you said in analyzing what has been happening over the past few years, that Europe is not focused on enhancing resilience. And while you were talking, I couldn't help but thinking about, the industrial policies that Europe has been implementing, with the Net Zero Industrial Act. So don't you think that these type of policies have been used to enhance resilience by increasing domestic productivity and domestic production? So I'm wondering, what do you think, if we can think about those policies as attempts at increasing, resilience in the way at least you present?
I think you have enough. You have enough material to go.
So thank you so much. So Annabelle, on the WTO, so I think the consensus view is that the WTO is sick, right? It's an organization that was in a sense represented every multilateral organization freezes a certain moment in history, right? So the IMF froze the moment in history where everyone was with the trauma of competitive devaluations and economic nationalism, and it was about preventing that, right? And the WTO froze the peak of the pro-globalization sentiment, and things went downhill from that immediately. And in that sense, the WTO was too ambitious as an organization to be completely effective in an environment where globalization is under fire. And its institutions, its internal setup was not resilient enough to continue operating or to resist this, unlike the IMF and the World Bank, by the way, which were more adaptive. And so the WTO has problems, but the idea of rules-based trade is an incredibly powerful idea, which is just makes sense. I mean, if a world where one country, you wouldn't have trade barriers. And the lesson from the Great Depression is that if every country is to themselves, then collectively the world goes down the drain. I mean, to prevent that, we need rules-based trade, and to enforce rules-based trade, we need something like the WTO. If the WTO didn't exist, we would have to invent it. But we would probably invent it a bit better than we did originally. Now, there is an important question, though. Particularly the European, I mean, first of all, advanced countries love rules-based trade to different degrees, and that depends on their dependence on trade. And so the European Union is very open, it's very integrated, so we love trade. The Americans are a little less open, they don't feel as strongly about trade. They would probably do a bit better in autarky than we do, even though they would do much worse than they do now. And so the question then is, how much is rules-based trade worth fighting for? The US perception is that rules-based trade has been killed and undermined by China. That China has systematically exploited the loopholes and used rules-based trade into its advantage. And since in the US view, they are in a superpower race with China, sticking to the rules of the WTO simply allows China to continue to do the harm. And since they're saying no to those rules, we, I think, are in a slightly different situation. We're not in a superpower competition with China. And for us, the costs of giving up on rules-based trades are much higher. Having said that, we also have a very big China problem. And so if you read the Draghi report, it is fascinating because Draghi, unlike what you might expect from sort of a centrist policymaker that has been educated at the same institutions than Tito and I, he does not go all out to defend the WTO. I mean, Draghi really doubles down on industrial policy, and his view of trade policy is that it should be subservient to industrial policy. He also says, well, the WTO is sort of a good idea, let's try and restart it, let's try and improve it. But at the same time, he advocates in his report measures that are illegal under WTO rules, like local content requirements. So stuff that wouldn't stand a chance in an IMF staff report, it would immediately be edited out by my former department. The Draghi report is full of these things. So the Draghi report is super interesting because it is as close to Bidenomics as the European can get, I think. And then the really critical question is, can you ignore some WTO rules selectively because you need them in your competition against China, while still broadly maintaining the restrictions and rules of rules-based trade? So the smartest people in the US administration, the ones that are not economic nationalists, the ones that realize that it's stupid to take back industrial job from Mexico, which is a lot of what this is about, right? So the really smart people in that administration, and I'm not going to say who they are of the view that even if we take all the jobs, the West Virginia problem, the battleground states out of the equation of the Inflation Reduction Act, and they are a very important part of the equation, we would still want to selectively violate some WTO rules, and it would be okay because the rest of the world would understand that we're only doing it because of China, not because of them. And so the edifice would not come crumbling down. Whereas I have so far taken the view that if Europe takes the same approach as the US, the edifice will come crumbling down because rules-based trade would lose its last big supporter. I don't know. Maybe these guys who sort of want us to go closer to the edge are correct. Okay, Bruegel is independent. I don't regularly interact with the European Commission. Since we write a lot about the European Commission, we try to be arm's length, but of course we interact. And this, what I was reporting about, was not anything systematic. It was simply that the people who did these dependency studies of the European Commission, which we are criticizing quite a lot in this report, so they very generously invited me to give a seminar, just like this one. So the chief economist of DG GROW, which is the internal market directorate, which interestingly was in the lead on these things, a very nice Spanish guy, Roman Arjona, he invited me to give a seminar, and then we had a discussion. So that's what it meant. Okay, on Manuela's point, so I agree with you. So it was on one of my slides that we have an added complication in the EU, which is that the costs of de-risking are not equally shared. I mean, they're very country specific. I do think that the dependency argument is sort of at the EU level because we have free trade in the EU, right? So if some stuff is missing, it's going to hit everyone, right? But what is not at the EU level is the costs of the policies that you need to get to reduce dependency, right? So this is why, if we go through the export side, the Germans are going to be hit. If we go through the import side, someone else is going to be hit. And that's always a source, as you saw with the EV tariffs, that's going to be a source of division. And that's a problem, something that China can exploit. And then the Net Zero Industry Act. So in my view, it doesn't have anything to do with resilience. I think this is basically it's misleading. I mean, it's claims to be about resilience of economic security. As I've shown you, it's not. It's about, advanced technology that helps us in our competitiveness. It's not resilience against foreign shocks, coercion. These are different things. And again, if we could not import the solar panels from China for a while, nothing would happen. We don't need our own solar panel industry in order to be resilient. Having said that, the intention to promote some of these industries is probably fine. It's not been around for very long. It hasn't had an impact, and it has quite weak instruments. And if you read the Draghi report, he basically agrees with the purposes of the NZIA, but he wants it sort of multiplied. He wants it on steroids. He wants it with money. He wants the local content requirement. He basically wants to turn the NZIA into an IRA, into a version of the Inflation Reduction.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm also studying the MEPP program with Annabelle. Regarding the decoupling from China, I'm wondering what effect would this have on trade deflection and trade diversion within the EU?
Any other question? Take another one. Yes.
I hardly read there, but one thing that is a problem to me is 0.5. That EU political economy is very difficult. EU political economy very difficult nowadays is to me seems the main problem. Why? Because the EU is no longer a unitary force. It's a confederation. It's more and more a confederation than the union. That is because what is really the situation now is that individual countries of the so-called EU have a problem with deciding together what to do, considering the political economy, also the war economy relative to the East and the West and the Southeast. It is the Ukraine and near Israel and so on. So countries, whenever now have problems like this to decide about, don't have just a political economy, EU political economy. Each one is formal. And unless we consider in any study like this, unless we consider this fact, this unfortunate fact, seems to be that we don't go down to the main point.
Yes, so this might maybe just me using misleading terminology. So I meant it the way you meant it, right? That there are disagreements within the EU on economic security measures, and that these disagreements are even bigger on the export side than on the import side. So on the import side, I think we have a broad consensus that we need to be less dependent on China, and then people disagree on what exactly this means. And some, may be concerned that by being too aggressive on the import side, we are triggering retaliation by China. But the reason why I'm concerned is because they're concerned about their exports. But if we go straight into reducing export to China, then we are directly getting to this hornet's nest that some countries really want to defend this. Moreover, we have a slow growth problem in the EU. So there's directly a trade-off between trying to be a bit less dependent on the export side and growth. But I think I meant it exactly like you did. The EU is not a unitary actor, and so that makes the political economy particularly difficult. Jessica's question, I didn't completely understand it. So I don't think, so there is a trade diversion problem, for example, between the US and the EU. So the Trump tariffs have led to less trade integration between the US and China. And as a result, in the EU, even though we didn't do anything, we are trading a lot more with China. So that's a classic diversion problem. So what we might push forward, we might be happening anyway, is to reduce trade between the EU and China, in which case there will be trade diversion to other
blocks, the global south, like on the EVs, for example, that's what will happen. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, do you think Chinese goods could still, in some sort of way, get into the EU, like through the Western Balkan route, or would it still be traded on the EU market?
Yes, so sure, but I mean, this is not. Are you worried about this in the context of, what if China tries to stop sending us goods, or are you saying what if we try to reduce our integration with China? And what is the
Like, I'm
context?
thinking more like producers within the EU who would still maybe prefer to get their goods from China
Yes,
and
yes.
then would route it through
Yes,
other
yes,
routes.
yes. Yes, I understand. I mean, remember, this is not a sanctions idea yet, right? This is simply about trading a bit less across the board. And so you could have instruments to do that. I mean, you could, for example, have a diversification charge or something like that, where you basically, would be neutral, maybe it would even be WTO compliant. That's a little unclear, but you were basically saying we're going to tax corporations that are highly concentrated in their export structure because they're putting themselves and the rest of Europe at risk. You're doing something like that, that would have an effect on their trade. And there's no sense in that this can be circumvented. I mean, firms would adapt optimally to this, and if it's not enough, you increase the charge. Right? So it's not the same as a sanctions situation.
Question? Yes.
I'm Philip. I also study on the European Public Policy Program. I have two questions. So one is back to the Draghi report. Obviously, the Draghi report does include a section on economic security, and he does talk about it to some extent. I wonder, considering the decoupling with China in the long-term decoupling would have a negative effect on GDP and obviously GDP growth probably as well, and considering EU already has low growth, how do you think that decoupling combined with Draghi's investments and so on, would it overall produce growth, or would it still be low growth because of decoupling? Would the decoupling weaken the innovation part of Draghi's proposals? The other question would be, considering that we might get a second Trump administration and that the WTO is already relatively weak, do you think that European countries or EU in general would be more willing to break some EU rules, such as the anti-coercion instrument that they came up with but used as a deterrent in the future, or do you think the EU will still, and the EU countries will still abide by the rules, even if marginal breaking of the rules will maybe benefit their policy goals?
And for answering questions. My question is more broadly on whether you have factored in climate change or potential consequences of climate change, or the impact of climate change mitigating policies within that report, and if so, how it might affect such scenarios. Thank you.
May I just add one question myself? Following that was Giorgio was saying. So you have a model in which you are able to compute what is the cost of shutting down China, both on import and the export side. And you have all European countries. So you should be able to know how much each country is losing. So do you have an estimate of the kind of transfers that are needed to create a consensus for such policies?
Yeah. Something like 10% of GDP.
European GDP.
Well, look, it's very easy, right? So the countries that would be, let's focus on the long-term welfare costs, right? And they're somewhere in the range between 0.3% of the GDP at the bottom and 1.2, which is Germany and Holland and the Dutch. So then the average is whatever, 0.7, and then you can add up the difference between those, and that's basically what it would be, I think. Okay, the point about the Draghi report and decoupling. So indeed, Draghi has a chapter on economic security. It's super narrow. It's only about import de-risking on critical raw materials. So there's none of the other things that are in this report are in there. It's really only, oh, we need to make sure the Chinese don't cut us off from critical raw materials. We need a foreign policy to do that. So he does not in any way advocate decoupling or a reduction of integration with China beyond what is needed to get away from this dependency in a very narrow area. Yes.
I didn't mean that he said it. I mean, he said he had a point about your economic security. I thought if we take it further and do a decoupling thing, how would that interact with the rest of his report?
Oh, okay. So the question was, if we go into this reduction in trade integration, what would happen? Would be very bad. Would be very bad, right? It would be costly, right? Then the question is it worth it? And so, in the type of model that they used, Bakay et al., the answer depends on what is the probability of a large shock, which then forces you to decouple anyway within a much more shorter period, right? So it's all about the counterfactual. If China's nice, it's just stupid. If we know that, you know, they're going to attack Taiwan in 2 years and we'll go simply shut down our trade with them, we should integrate, right? It's all about the counterfactual. But of course, it would be bad for growth. Now, how big? Debatable. Right? If you look at the static welfare losses, not so big if you do it slowly. Maybe this type of model is not dynamic enough. Maybe there's sort of, you know, TFP, innovation, these sorts of things are probably not in this model. So maybe this is underestimated as a cost. But on the other hand, you know, the basic intuition is that if we do this slowly, the rest of the world is still very big. Maybe it's not so terrible. And then on the point about climate change, so indeed, so one of the casualties of this de-risking stuff is, and also one of the reasons why I insist that we should be a little bit careful about what sort of de-risking we promote, is that the cost of the green transition will be high, right? So this is why, you know, the solar panel stuff is a red herring. It's just a lose-lose, I think. You know, it's maybe there's an attempt to get some of these jobs back, but it would clearly be bad for us to not buy Chinese solar panels. Then on the EVs, you can have different views. So I support the Commission tariffs, the EU tariffs on China, because I think of it as being sort of a measured response within the WTO rules to something that might really threaten the European car industry. And I think of it as sort of demonstrating that you can do protection in a more nuanced, more rules-based way than how the Americans do it. But there's another view which I also sympathize with, which is this is going to make our transition in the transport sector harder, right? Because, you know, by BYDs and Geelys and so on, they're great cars. They're very cheap, much cheaper than the corresponding European cars. And if we keep buying them, we might get out of fossil internal combustion engine cars much faster. And also the backlash might be lower, right? Because it's particularly the poorer people that get hurt by these tariffs, right? Those that would buy these cheaper cars, right? So we are forcing them to buy these expensive cars. So the whole green transition, again, then becomes a cost of living shock, and then they start voting for the far right, right? So there are very strong, good arguments to be against these tariffs. There are also good arguments to be in favor of them. So my favorite way of thinking about them is that if it were true that China would sort of sign on the dotted line to send us really cheap manufacturing goods for the rest of history, then it would be probably in our interest to specialize in services and museums and things like we're good at it in Italy and so on, just buy their cheap stuff. But I think this wave of cheap material from China is a temporary phenomenon. It's not that they would deliberately reverse that, but they have a weird economic problem there where they've just gone crazy on investment, they've gone crazy on industrial capacity, and you know, the prices are going rock bottom, and this cannot last. They will not be able to subsidize this. I mean, fiscally, this is unsustainable, and it's unsustainable in their own internal market because these are then loss-making firms. So there will be a big shakeout. And so when they're through with this shakeout in 5 or 10 years, we should still have an industry. Right? That's what justifies some protection, I think.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ian. I'm international affairs student, and so my question was, so you mentioned like the risk of damage to cohesion with de-risking, and so I was wondering if you could speak more on that and how it could impact European cohesion, like what divides we might see. And then my second question was, what measures could the EU take in terms of reducing trade friction with allies to reduce the harm from decoupling trade with China?
Hi, I'm Luke, and you said that kind of markets might be correcting and that decoupling without government-led intervention is already kind of occurring between the EU and China. And I was wondering how much of that you speculate might be based on firms' own risk assessments on like China versus maybe them trying to get ahead of future government interventions and government-led decoupling. So how much might be just market-driven and how much might be anticipation of getting ahead of a government intervention?
Very, very short question. I'm not even sure whether you're the right person to ask because you're an economist, not a political scientist. You mentioned how if you guys violate certain rules of the WTO, everyone will see, oh, it's not because of us, it's because of China, and they will be fine with it. But if Europe does the same, this will not be the case, and everyone will lose their vote and their belief in the rules-based tax system. Why? Why is that the case? Because couldn't Europe also very well signal, hey, it's just because of China or maybe US?
Yeah, let me start with the last one. So I may not have stated this clearly enough. I didn't want to say that the US and Europe are completely different along these lines. I just wanted to say that there are two narratives. One is this narrative that the enlightened people in the Biden administration would use to sell Bidenomics. They would say, oh, just look beyond this getting jobs back to the US stuff. Even if we were only concerned about China, this was about jobs back in the US, we might do the same, and we still think this can be reconciled with maintaining rules-based trade, because everyone understands that this is not about getting jobs back, even though they also say that. So that's why the narrative is a little implausible, necessarily plausible. But you could sell it that way, and so it's possible that we could sell it the same way. And if we did, we would have to make it credible by accompanying it with, say, Global Gateway or other forms of international partnerships that are really about creating manufacturing jobs in the global south. So it doesn't look like the zero-sum game that we just put these jobs back. So it's a narrative that might work for the EU, but because it gets wrapped up into sort of generic economic nationalism, we just want the jobs back, which is what the IRA is partly about. It's a very risky strategy. It may look to a country like Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia that we're using China as an excuse, but in fact, what we really want is to bring back the jobs from emerging markets to Germany or keep them there, right? So it's risky. Okay, Luke's point, this is super good question. I haven't thought about it, and I'm not sure we could empirically distinguish it, but if you have an idea, it would make it a great thesis. Okay, I mean, because as everyone understood, it was a really sophisticated question, right? I mean, he was asking, if we are observing declines in exports, is that because firms are scared of China, or is it because they are scared of government intervention in Europe or in the US and want to get ahead of the game, right? Which is a bit like a transition risk argument in the climate literature, right? So you sort of take a policy announcement that's credible, and then you think, oh, in this future world where the policy announcement comes true, I don't want to have stranded assets, so I want to kind of get out of China. So I don't know the answer. I don't think there have been very strong policy statements, so I think it's mainly the first, the market itself, the direct effects, but it would be a really nice thesis to try and look at some announcements and look at, maybe there's a way of empirically distinguishing that, but it will be very hard to do. So I wouldn't advise you to put all your bets on this. And then finally, Ian asked about cohesion. So there are two types of cohesion issues. This goes back also to this thing that Manuela said. So one is that we have these differences in trade structure within the EU, and so the Germans, they really have, a lot of German car manufacturers' profits are made in China, and so they will be much more reluctant to interfere with that than other European countries. So that's the direct impact. And then there's a fascinating thing, which is about free riding, which is the Hungary example. So I don't think that Hungary sort of intrinsically has a structural argument to be more pro-China, but they have simply specialized. So they're within the EU. They benefit from some of the protection. They're also small. So they think they can free ride it. To some extent, they've been successful in doing it. So they deviate from the normal EU approach and then get showered with gifts from China. That's a good strategy for them. So that's another type of heterogeneity.
That's another round of questions.
Hi, thank you. My name is Massimo. I'm a second year Maya student here. My question is more about how China is preparing or maybe de-risking itself, thinking about assessing all of the risks that we've been talking about. If we're talking about the Europe decoupling from China, how are these conversations from your perspective occurring in China, thinking that maybe some of their trade partners might be trying to get away from their dependency on them? Thank you.
Any other question?
Okay, Massimo. So I'm not a China expert, so I don't know so much about the Chinese position, but what I've been told is that China has very aggressively for about 10 years, more or less coinciding with Xi Jinping, pursued quite a deliberate set of policies to reduce dependencies from others and create dependencies to them, right? I'm told it's a more or less explicit policy objective. And, the dependency argument, it has a tradition. Anyway, I don't want to be a pop sinology here, but it had to do with the way that they were mistreated by Europeans in the 19th century, things like that. Now, my understanding is that this has taken the form of pursuing a self-sufficiency agenda on raw materials, which extends the Belt and Road Initiative and things like that, and of course tech. And then the other side of that is the creation of dependencies. So they have power actually over us, which is the flip side of these numbers that you saw here. And now the thing that gets lost in this whole thing is, of course, the point is still they're still selling an awful lot, of course, right? So this coincides with overinvestment, aggressive pricing, state subsidies that then finds its way into exports. And so, they are reducing the dependency on specific products like raw materials or tech, but at the same time, they're generating the mother of all export dependencies, which is why in this model, the Baccagliardal model, the hits to China from a sudden stop to trade is much bigger than that for any other country. So it's these two things that they have to somehow live with, and there is not. It seems, the Chinese argue there's no such thing as overcapacity, and it's a bad term. Economists don't like that term, but they're very, very high integrated, and probably, they export a lot for the wrong reasons, because they don't have a lot of domestic demand. They don't have a lot of domestic demand, partly because people don't consume enough. They save in certain quantities. It has to do with their social safety net and institutions and all those kinds of things. And institutions like the IMF have been telling them for 2 decades that this is a problem, but they have so far not taken the advice. And at this point, there might be a big backlash. If there's a big backlash, they would probably be in trouble.
Any other last question? If not, well, let me thank you, Jeromin, for coming, and we hope that you again here in Bologna. And for the great conversation, thank you again. Thank you.
Great questions. Yeah.